Well, thanks for tuning in. Now, let's get into that High Court ruling from yesterday. And with regard to that ruling that declared levels 4 and 3 of lockdown regulations unconstitutional, the suspension of that has also been set for 14 days, which will allow Cabinet to fully study the arguments and rectify. Now, this case was brought to the High Court by a Liberty Fighters Network, which said that the restrictions were unlawful and unconstitutional because the state of emergency had not been declared. Now, to discuss all of this further, we're joined by Professor Pierre de Vos, who is both a constitutional law expert and also the chair of the Claude Leon Foundation in Constitutional Governance at the University of Cape Town, as well as Mike Law, constitutional law expert and senior researcher at Paternoster Group on Zoom. Thanks so much, gentlemen, for speaking to us this morning, and welcome to Morning Live. Professor de Vos, let's start with you. Perhaps we should start by trying to understand exactly what the difference is between a state of emergency and a state of disaster, as this seems to have been part of the argument that was brought by Liberty Fighters Network.
Yeah, so the difference is, of course, that if you have a state of emergency, then most of the rights in the Bill of Rights can be derogated from, so they can be limited in a way that goes beyond what normally would be required. If you have, manage the crisis through the state of disaster, then all the rights remain in place, and that's why the judge in the judgment said the problem with the whole regulatory scheme is that it didn't start from the point of view that one must limit the rights of people as little as possible. The regulations were drafted starting with the view that we will do anything that is necessary to deal with this, regardless of what the rights might actually say. I think that's what the judge, in essence, said.
So, Mike, with regard to what this judgment actually means for where we are now on level 3 of a nationwide lockdown, please explain to us exactly what it will mean for the layperson starting today, and given what the judge has said, allowing the government an opportunity to rectify what was actually put out.
Yeah, well, the truth of the matter is that for the foreseeable future, at least, the judgment probably means nothing much. The government has 14 days to amend or review the regulations, in which time I would be very surprised they didn't appeal. And this matter will probably be resolved by the constitutional courts. I think we've seen in other litigation, especially the tobacco-led litigation that springs to mind, the government has been keen to push these cases out as far as they can. And so they'll probably appeal the judgment. Quite frankly, they should, not necessarily just in the merits, but because it raises very important questions of constitutional law, of how to apply the rationality test in these cases, and the extent to which a court can be involved in these type of decisions at a time of disaster like this.
So, Professor de Vos, if we get into this rationality test, how, if you can, by example, for us, actually indicate what the judge actually means by means of example during level 3 of the nationwide lockdown?
Well, the judge correctly cites the rationality test, which says if you make a regulation, then there must be some rational link between the regulation and the purpose that you're trying to achieve. So if you prohibit people from buying alcohol on a Friday, then you must show that this is directly linked either to stopping the spread of COVID-19 or in some other ways making sure that people can be treated for the virus if they get sick. If you can make that link, then you have a rational regulation. If there's no link, then there's no rational regulation. In this case, though, with the judge, did it confuse, in a way, the rationality test with a different question, and that is whether the regulations limit the rights in the Bill of Rights. That is a different question from the rationality test. I think he mixed them up, which is one of the reasons why the judgment could easily be appealed, I think.
And I saw on Twitter, Professor De Vos, you saying that the judgment is actually all over the place and not an example of a forensic precision.
Yes, so that is it's the question. So because the things are so mixed up, usually when you're going to declare invalid regulations, then you have to go and look at each and every regulation, specific regulation. You have to say why that particular regulation is irrational if you use the rationality test, or it is a limitation on any one of the rights, but then you have to say which right. In this case, the judge just gave examples of some of the regulations. Some of them level 4 regulations are irrational, and some of them obviously were, but and then said, well, all the regulations except for smoking, closing of casinos and so on, will be declared invalid and unconstitutional. So that's not really the way in which normally these tests are applied.
And speaking of smoking, Mike Law, many people believe that that is actually what lies at the heart of people bringing these litigations against the state at this point. Because quite apart from these regulations being rational and constitutional, people are just, fed up with government basically acting as though we're living in a nanny state, as it were. So what's your view on that?
Well, on the tobacco case itself, this was mentioned in the judgment. Basically, Judge Davis said that because the matter is due to be come before the same court in the next week, that this judgment that was passed yesterday wouldn't make any finding on the rationality of the tobacco ban. I think there's value in that, seeing that it was about to come before the court, but on the same hand, if the judge was willing to declare the entire regulatory framework for level 3 and 4 irrational, it's hard to see how tobacco could be excluded from that judgment. But the tobacco case, it will find its way through the courts very soon. And surely this case will be strong in the mind of that full bench of the North Gauteng High Court. And certainly if this judgment is any indication to go on, government is going to find it very difficult to explain that ban is rational and serves the purpose that it's trying to achieve, because as Professor De Vos says, the means employed to achieve an objective must be rationally connected to that purpose. And of course, if it's not achieving that purpose because people aren't quitting smoking, then that's not really working, and it's not really a rational decision.
Professor De Vos, your view on that? Because there is quite a strong lobby with regard to the ban on tobacco sales.
Yes, so the one must distinguish two things. The one is whether you think that tobacco is a good thing and that people should smoke. And the other one is whether one can use the Disaster Management Act to try and get people to stop smoking. If that was the purpose, the regulations would be rational, because the Disaster Management Act does not empower the minister to do general health regulations. She only can make regulations that is aimed at actually suppressing COVID-19 or protecting lives related to COVID-19. And I think from the paper so far, the minister has made a very strong case that tobacco is bad for you, but not a very strong case that if you stop using tobacco for 2 or 3 weeks, which most people are not doing, that your life will be better off, that you might survive COVID easier, that you won't get COVID. That link, I think, is going to be one of the problems that she might face in court.
So, Mike Law, in law, when is government allowed to step in for the broader good of society?
Yeah, I think this is the crux of the problem. I don't think anyone really anticipated a time like this where government would have to take such fast and sweeping measures. So in this case, I think it makes sense that the government that is able to centralize power a little bit, but that structure, of course, must still comply with the Constitution, with the legal framework, and also our democratic framework, in that it can't exclude various opposition voices from the parliamentary process. Again, that particular question of the constitutionality of the Disaster Management Act and the National Command Council wasn't a part of the finding of this court. But the other question it raises, of course, as it will, is the extent to which it's appropriate for the judicial branch of government to make findings against the government here when it comes to the merits of the policies that they propose. Obviously, the argument must be dismissed that a court can never do that, because this is what the Constitution requires. All branches of government are equal. But it's not just a question of constitutional competence, it's also institutional competence. One must ask which is the appropriate forum to be making these decisions on which is the best way to have our safe set of regulations. Is it a single judge in the North Gauteng High Court, or is it a government of experienced governance experts and medical and political advisors? That's going to be another question that the Constitutional Court is going to have to grapple with. Where is that line between judicial overreach, so to speak, and the judiciary doing the job that it's become famous for and admirable for in South Africa, for holding the executives to account?
And Professor de Vos, many people are, of course, concerned and have expressed as much regarding judicial overreach. But what does this judgment now essentially mean for the regulations that are currently in place having to be redrafted, as it were?
If the judgment is not appealed, then the minister has 14 days to redraft the regulations in a way that is limiting still achieves the purpose, but limits the rights in the Bill of Rights as little as possible and is rational. The order is a little bit vague, so we don't know what the criteria would be specifically. So it's not very easy to implement that particular provision. So I would think for that reason alone, there's probably going to be an appeal to the Constitutional Court of this judgment.
Professor de Vos, if the regulations are deemed unconstitutional, does that necessarily mean that the rights of citizens have been violated? And what recourse then would there arise for citizens if you've, for example, been arrested during lockdown level 3 or 4 and having been declared to have broken some of the lockdown regulations? Do you have any recourse at this stage?
Well, the judgment didn't say. It was silent on this matter. So the question then is what happens? Normally, when the court declares invalid a law or regulation, the invalidation is from the moment that the law became invalid, which was the day that it was promulgated. So everything that, unless the court says otherwise, anything done in terms of the regulations from the moment they were passed is as if it never happened. So the people who paid a fine, then their criminal record should be expunged. They should get back their money because there was no legal basis for this. That is what normally happens. Courts can limit that by saying, well, we're not going to make this order retrospective. We're not going to make it go backward. But this court didn't attend to that matter. So that would mean, yes, that if it stands, any arrest and whatever goes with it would not have been done in terms of the law, and there could be recompense for that.
And of course, Mike Law, people are now questioning the National Command Council's grasp of the law. Would you say that is fair?
Yes and no. I think, look, this is a completely unprecedented situation, obviously. And the type of regulatory intervention that's required is drastic. And that's true at each change in level of the lockdown. So to change a sort of whole regulatory framework on how we can move and do business from level 5 to level 4 to level 3, it's inevitable that in doing so, there'll be some anomalies that pop up, like the beach and the promenade and the rotisserie chickens and things like that. And I'm not saying those are all right, but those are things that are bound to happen, and they should be quickly corrected, whether it's through court review, or you would hope that government, which has failed to do in most cases, would be able to go and think about it and come back and change their approach. So What we hope doesn't happen is that this judgment casts doubt completely on the government's COVID-19 response, because despite the fact that there are these small and sometimes pretty important individual regulations that are rational, I think it's pretty hard to argue that the overall strategy of a hard lockdown followed by a gradual phase exit and as itself is irrational. And that's one of the problems that I have with the judgment that was delivered yesterday, that will be an issue on appeal, is not so much that a judgment was delivered against the government on the rationality of some of these regulations, which I don't think surprised anyone. But what surprised me was the extent that it did so. This was a very sweeping judgment.
And again, just staying with that point for a moment, people are now pretty confused, and you can see that from speaking to colleagues, from reading what people are saying on social media platforms. They are saying they are very confused about what this actually means. And if we take a look and drawing from that judgment, what would you conclude about the way government actually handled the lockdown at different levels overall to this point? Mike Law first, and then Professor De Vos, I'll take your view on that as well.
Look, I don't think it says too much about how government handled the crisis from a general point of view, which is strange how then gets to the conclusion that the whole sort of regulatory framework is irrational. I think the judgment starts off by saying that the nature of the problem that government was presented with, and that generally their approach has been an admirable one. And I don't think this judgment is meant to cast doubt over the general strategy. As I said, would it mean that the public lose some faith in governments? I think that was happening anyway. I think the heavy-handedness of the police and the inflexibility and stubbornness, if you will, on amending some of the city measures that have been included in the generally admirable framework have already started to be exposed, and the public have already started to lose confidence and trust in the government, as well as the communications failures that come with that in so many cases. So yes, as I said, I think it's a good sign that we have a court system that can rule freely and independently against governments, and I think that's encouraging for all of us to see that the court will stand up for our rights and be that final bulwark against the abuse of power. But at the same time, I don't think that that it means that the government is entirely doesn't know what it's doing.
Professor De Vos, and also if you can, as you wrap it up for us, just once again bottom line it for us in terms of what this means and where to from here.
Okay, so for me, if you look at the judgment and you take the judgment on its own, clearly what the court said is that there was too much secrecy and not enough reasons given and justifications given for specific decisions. That's the first criticism, and the second criticism was that the government, in terms of their own papers, said that they will use any means necessary to achieve the purpose, and the court said that's a little bit too much. Of course, I think I agree with those criticisms. The problem was then what the court did to solve the problem, and they declared all the regulations invalid in one sweeping way, which is probably not appropriate to do. But what we have now is, for the moment, there is actually no change. We still have the regulations. The regulations in terms of level 3 is in place. They will remain in place for the next 2 weeks at least. And then they will have to be amended in terms of the court order. If they are not, if the government doesn't want to do that, which I think they won't, they're going to appeal. As soon as they appeal, the suspension of the invalidity is also suspended. So the regulations are going to remain in place for the foreseeable future until this case is resolved, I would think.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time this morning. Professor Pierre de Vos, a constitutional law expert, talking through yesterday's judgment, and also Mike Law, another constitutional law expert, also giving us his analysis of what that judgment actually meant yesterday. With that, let's take a quick break before we get